Imagine being humiliated, despised, and still needing to maintain composure, dignity, and focus on your work. This was the reality for Amber Hartley, a dedicated nurse who faced one of the most difficult days of her career at St. Jude Memorial Hospital. Amber was known for her competence and empathy, but she also became the target of prejudiced looks and silent acts of discrimination. The climax of this hostility occurred when she was publicly humiliated by the arrogant and renowned Dr. Quentin Lawson, in front of all her colleagues and patients. However, what no one could foresee was that one of those patients, attentively watching every detail, held a surprising secret, and what he witnessed would change everything. Amber always knew she would have to fight harder than most to be recognized for what really mattered: her skills as a nurse. From her first day at the hospital, she felt the curious and judging looks. It wasn't because of her ability to care for patients, that was undeniable, but because she was different. With her dark skin and strong posture, Amber challenged deep-rooted prejudices in an environment where progress and acceptance seemed to move at a slow pace. Her talent wasn't enough to erase the discomfort that some seemed to feel when they saw her. There was a weight in the air when she walked through the corridors, as if her mere presence was an uncomfortable reminder that she didn't fit into what many considered normal. Despite the difficulties, Amber devoted herself with determination to every task, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. What should have been an opportunity to show her professional value ended up becoming a constant test of patience and endurance. She was often assigned the most difficult cases, handling situations that required extra effort and long working hours. Still, her achievements went unnoticed or were ignored, as if merit could never be attributed to her. Colleagues avoided her, preferring to keep conversations to a minimum, and many doctors treated her suggestions as if they were insignificant. Dr. Quentin Lawson was the worst of them all. Lawson, a prestigious surgeon at the hospital, was respected by much of the staff, but his arrogance was undeniable. He believed that his title and experience put him above everyone, especially someone like Amber. With a cold and condescending demeanor, he rarely spoke directly to her, and when he did, it was to correct or discredit her actions. It was as if he took pleasure in belittling her, constantly reminding her that, in his view, she did not belong on the same level as her colleagues. However, Amber never let her confidence be shaken. She knew her skills and dedication spoke louder, even if it wasn't recognized at that moment. What Amber didn't expect was that, on one of the most intense days of her career, this dynamic between her and Lawson would culminate in a public episode of humiliation. Amber was caring for a critically ill patient, and as usual, her attention to detail and clinical instinct guided her. She made a suggestion during a consultation, something that could improve the patient's condition. However, her intervention was met with disdain by Lawson. He interrupted her abruptly, discrediting her in front of everyone present. "I think you don't understand the full picture, Miss Hartley. Let the professionals handle this," said Lawson, with a disdainful smile that froze the room. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Amber felt the weight of every person's gaze in the room, as if everyone was waiting to see her reaction. Her heart raced, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. With her head held high, she maintained her firm posture without responding to Lawson's provocation. But what she didn't know was that, at that moment, there was someone there who was paying much closer attention than the others. Mr. Lincoln Gaines, a patient admitted after a severe accident, was observing every detail of the interaction. Lincoln, who had already noticed the dynamics of the hospital and Dr. Lawson's behavior, saw something different in Amber. He noticed how she maintained her dignity even when she was clearly being disrespected. Lincoln's keen eyes didn't miss a single movement, not a word exchanged. And what he saw at that moment not only left a mark on him, but also made him reflect on something much bigger than the simple relationship between a nurse and an arrogant doctor. When Amber Hartley first entered Lincoln Gaines' room, she found him resting, still recovering from the serious accident that nearly cost him his life. He seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts, like many of the VIP patients Amber had cared for before. However, there was something different about Lincoln. Despite his reserved posture, his eyes followed her every move, as if each gesture, each detail was worthy of his attention. He observed discreetly but with deep focus, noticing the precise and calm way Amber carried out her tasks, even in moments that could create tension. Amber, as always, focused on the patient. She treated him with the same dedication she gave to everyone, without making a distinction between VIPs and other patients. To Amber, the health of the person in front of her was what truly mattered, not their social status or the luxury surrounding them. Although it was hard to ignore the environment that surrounded Lincoln, the private room, the respectful silence of the other nurses, the meticulous attention he received, Amber refused to let it influence her conduct. She always kept her head in the work, indifferent to the cold and distant treatment she often received from her colleagues. After all, she knew that prejudice was present there, masked by professional formalities, but her commitment to her patients was unshakable. The first days of caring for Lincoln passed quietly, with few interactions beyond the necessary ones. However, slowly, something curious began to happen. Lincoln, who initially kept silent, began to open up, showing interest in learning more about Amber. He asked questions about the procedures, about the hospital, and gradually, their conversations became more personal. He wanted to know about Amber's experience at the hospital, how she felt about the work environment. Amber, though hesitant to share her most sincere opinions, responded politely. Lincoln, on the other hand, could read between the lines that things were not so simple for her. Lincoln Gaines wasn't just any patient. He carried with him a commanding presence, an authority that came from years of experience and wisdom. His past, although little discussed, revealed a man who had faced many challenges in life. And now, he was intrigued by Amber, not only by her professional skill but by the inner strength she displayed, day after day, even in the face of the evident hostility from some colleagues. To Lincoln, there was something fascinating about this young nurse. He observed how she interacted with others, noticing the subtle signs of disrespect she received and how, despite it all, Amber never lost her composure. Over time, Lincoln began to notice more and more details about the environment surrounding Amber. It was impossible to ignore the veiled disdain in the expressions of some doctors and nurses. Lincoln, a man accustomed to being treated with deference, was surprised to see how Amber was treated differently, even though she was just as competent as any other member of the team. There were judgmental looks, whispers in the corridors, and a clear indifference in professional interactions. Each small humiliation was perceived by Lincoln, who found himself increasingly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. One day, while Amber was adjusting the monitor beside the bed, Lincoln asked a direct question that surprised her. "Amber, why do they treat you like this?" The nurse paused for a moment, considering how to respond. It wasn't common for a patient to notice these dynamics, much less comment on them. Amber smiled slightly, as if wanting to ease the weight of the situation, and answered with restraint. "I guess I'm a bit different from what they expected." Lincoln remained silent for a few seconds, taking in the answer. He knew exactly what that meant, and his perception of the hospital and of Amber began to change even more. Lincoln didn't stop there. His curiosity intensified, and he began to watch even more closely the interactions around Amber. He saw the disdain in the looks, the malicious comments that sometimes escaped in the corridors, and the uncomfortable silence that settled whenever she was around. But what impressed Lincoln the most was the way Amber handled it all. She never lost her calm, never let her guard down, and continued to do her work with the same dedication and competence as always. Lincoln couldn't understand how someone so talented and committed could be the target of such disrespect. The conversations between Lincoln and Amber became more frequent and deeper. There was a sincerity in the way Amber talked about her work and her life, a passion that Lincoln admired. He began to see her not just as a nurse, but as a strong person who faced invisible challenges daily, but evident to him. And slowly, Lincoln began to realize that perhaps he had a bigger role to play in that situation. As a VIP patient, he had access to certain privileges and a voice that could make a difference. And, although Amber didn't know it, Lincoln Gaines was not just an ordinary patient. As the days went by, Lincoln felt more and more uncomfortable with what he witnessed in the hospital. He knew that, with the power he possessed, he could influence change. But up until that moment, he had remained silent. Something inside him, however, told him that he couldn't continue like this. Amber didn't deserve to be treated that way, and he was starting to realize that his time there as a patient might have a greater purpose than just his own recovery. The tension in the hospital was almost palpable, as if something was about to happen. Amber Hartley could feel that changes were on the horizon, though she had no idea what exactly was coming. In recent days, Lincoln Gaines' behavior had become even more introspective. He observed every detail, but now with a look of decision, as if he were pondering something important. Amber's curiosity grew as she noticed this shift, but, maintaining her professional posture, she didn't ask questions. She knew that patients like Lincoln, accustomed to luxury and special attention, often kept their thoughts and concerns to themselves. One day, as Amber was adjusting the bed linens, Lincoln broke the silence. "Amber," he began, his voice firm but gentle. "I think it's time I told you something." Amber turned, surprised by the seriousness of his words. It wasn't common for a patient to start this kind of conversation, especially someone as reserved as Lincoln. "Have you ever wondered why I'm treated with so much privilege here?" he continued, not waiting for an immediate response. Amber frowned, unsure of how to reply. She knew he was a VIP patient, but beyond that, his status was a mystery. Lincoln took a deep breath and looked directly into her eyes. "I'm the CEO of Gaines Medical Group, the largest hospital network in the country," he revealed. Amber felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard of this powerful medical group, but never imagined that the man before her was the head of it all. Lincoln's words echoed in Amber's mind. CEO of Gaines Medical Group? The magnitude of this revelation left her in a mix of surprise and admiration. Not only because he was a man of immense power, but because despite that, he had treated her with respect and consideration, something many of her colleagues, with much less influence, failed to do. Lincoln continued, "I'm here by chance, of course, but what I've seen these past days has opened my eyes to something much bigger." Amber remained silent, processing his words. She knew Lincoln had power, but only now was she beginning to realize how much his presence there could change the course of things. Lincoln paused, as if carefully considering his next words. "What happened to you here will not go unnoticed," he said, with a firmness that Amber had never seen before. "I've watched everything, how you were treated, how your competence was questioned, simply because of who you are. That is unacceptable." Lincoln's words hit Amber hard. She had always known she faced prejudice in the hospital, but hearing it from someone with the power to do something about it brought a new perspective to the situation. She had never imagined that her daily experiences of discrimination could be so clearly noticed, especially by someone like Lincoln Gaines. From that moment on, Amber felt that something was indeed changing. Lincoln Gaines wasn't just an empathetic patient. He was a man of action. "I'm going to speak with Dr. Lawson," he said bluntly. Amber's eyes widened, surprised by the determination in his voice. Confronting Dr. Lawson, the head of the hospital and a man with such influence, wasn't something just anyone would do. But Lincoln Gaines wasn't just anyone. He was a man used to making changes, making big decisions, and now Amber was part of that decision. Despite Lincoln's declaration, Amber felt a slight anxiety. The idea of confronting someone like Dr. Lawson brought with it a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew that challenging someone so powerful in the hospital could have repercussions, not only for her but for the hospital as a whole. Sensing the concern on Amber's face, Lincoln tried to reassure her. "Don't worry, Amber. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who, like you, faces this kind of unfair treatment every day. I can't and won't ignore this." His words carried a promise of change, a promise that seemed to grow with each passing day. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the hospital shifted. Lincoln requested a meeting with the board, and rumors began to spread among the doctors and nurses. Amber, for her part, stayed focused on her work, trying not to pay attention to the whispers that circulated through the corridors. However, deep down, she knew that something monumental was about to happen. Lincoln Gaines wasn't a man of empty promises. If he said he would bring change, it was because he truly intended to do so. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. Lincoln Gaines, in a private meeting with the hospital board and Dr. Lawson, made a point of exposing everything he had witnessed during his stay. He spoke openly about the prejudice Amber faced, about the subtle racism that permeated the interactions among the healthcare professionals, and about the urgent need for systemic changes within the institution. Dr. Lawson, caught off guard, tried to justify his behavior, but Lincoln was relentless. This kind of attitude has no place in a hospital that should be focused on saving lives and respecting people, regardless of who they are, he stated firmly, showing no fear of the possible consequences. As Amber waited outside the meeting room, a mix of nervousness and hope overtook her. She knew something big was happening in there, something that could not only change her life but transform the entire dynamic of the hospital. And she knew, deep down, that Lincoln Gaines was the man who could make it happen. The revelation made by Lincoln Gaines wasn't just a shock to Memorial St. Jude. It was a true earthquake that shook the hospital's very foundation. In the weeks following that decisive meeting, the environment was overtaken by a wave of changes. The board, initially hesitant, quickly realized it would be impossible to ignore the weight of Lincoln's influence. Word began to spread through the corridors that the CEO of Gaines Medical Group had exposed the structural racism within the institution, and Amber Hartley, unknowingly, became a symbol of something much bigger than her own story. Amber, although relieved to finally see a light at the end of the tunnel, began to feel the weight of expectations on her shoulders. It was never her intention to be the center of attention, much less to become the catalyst for such significant change within the hospital. However, at the same time, a new wave of hope grew within her. There was something powerful in knowing that her struggle and experiences were serving as a beacon to open the eyes of so many people. Lincoln Gaines had planted the seed, and now the ground was ready for something new to grow. The first changes were subtle but noticeable. Amber began to see small gestures indicating a change in behavior among some colleagues. Although many still kept their distance, there was a clear effort to avoid the malicious comments and toxic behavior that had once been so common. The hospital started reviewing its internal guidelines, and new training sessions on prejudice and racism awareness were implemented. Amber knew it was only the beginning, but it was an important step in the right direction. However, not everyone was willing to accept the changes so easily. Dr. Quentin Lawson, who had been directly confronted by Lincoln Gaines, found himself in an uncomfortable position within the hospital. Amber noticed that, even after the exposure, he still treated her with the same disdain and coldness as before. But there was a difference now. Lawson was isolated. Colleagues who once supported him began to distance themselves, and his authority over the team was gradually eroded. He was no longer seen as untouchable, and that clearly bothered him deeply. As time passed, Amber's story and Lincoln Gaines' decisive stance against systemic racism began to be discussed in other hospitals within the Gaines Medical Network. It seemed that a spark had been lit, and the flame of change was starting to spread. Amber, despite still being surprised by how much her story had become an example, knew there was still much work to be done. True to his word, Lincoln continued to closely monitor the progress of changes at Memorial St. Jude. He ensured that the internal policies were reviewed seriously and, moreover, made sure that the voices of professionals like Amber were heard. He knew that true change couldn't come from top-down orders alone. It was necessary to listen to those who lived through injustices day by day. Although hesitant at first, Amber began to participate more actively in the discussions. She was still getting used to this new role of informal leadership, but she knew her voice was crucial to the process. As time went on, Amber began to earn the respect and admiration of many of her colleagues. What was once a relationship of exclusion and prejudice began to transform into collaboration and recognition. Of course, there were still challenges to overcome, but now she knew she was no longer alone. Lincoln's support, along with the changing mentality within the hospital, gave Amber the strength she needed to continue fighting for a fairer work environment. She wasn't just an exceptional nurse, but also an emerging leader in a movement of transformation. Memorial St. Jude, once so rigid in its traditions and prejudices, was finally beginning to make room for something new. Conversations in the hallways had changed in tone. The old, distasteful jokes and veiled racist comments started giving way to more serious discussions about inclusion, equality, and justice. Amber knew that all of this began with a simple act of courage: Lincoln Gaines' decision not to remain silent about what he saw. Now, Amber was seen as a figure of resilience and overcoming. Her story inspired not only her colleagues, but also people outside the hospital. There was something profoundly transformative about her journey, something that touched everyone who knew her path. Although Amber sometimes had moments of doubt or fatigue, each small sign of progress made her believe that all of it was worth it. Finally, Lincoln Gaines publicly announced that Gaines Medical Group would adopt stricter policies against racism throughout its hospital network. He made a point of citing Amber as an example of courage and resilience, recognizing the impact she had not only on Memorial St. Jude but across the entire institution. Her story had transcended the hospital walls and become a beacon of change for many. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more emotional journeys, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next video that's now appearing on your screen.